First and FirstOrDefault are the next two element methods, which we will learn in this video. Let's get started. As the name suggests, both methods are used to retrieve the first element of a sequence. A sequence here refers to any collection that implements the 𝗙𝗵𝗪𝗏 interface, such as a list or an array. Let's start with first method. It has two overloads. The first overload is used with empty braces. It returns the first element of a sequence. So, if the sequence contains elements, we get the first one as result, else an invalid operation exception will be thrown. The second overload is used with a lambda expression. It returns the first element in a sequence that satisfies a specified condition. So, if the sequence we get as result from the lambda expression contains elements, we get the first element as result, else an exception will be thrown. These are both overloads of first method. Later I will show you some examples, how to use this method in real use cases. Let's now move on to the second method, FirstOrDefault. This method has four overloads. Let's check them one by one. The first overload is used with empty braces. It returns the first element of a sequence, or a default value if the sequence contains no elements. So, in case the sequence contains elements, we get the first one, else the type's default value will be returned. The second overload is used with a default value inside the braces. It returns the first element of a sequence, or a specified default value if the sequence contains no elements. So, this overload also returns the first element of the sequence, in case the sequence contains elements, else the entered default value will be retrieved as result. This means, if the sequence is empty, we don't get the type's default value as result, but the default value we added. The third overload is used with a lambda expression inside the braces. It returns the first element of the sequence that satisfies a condition, or a default value if no such element is found. So, here we either get the first element, or the type's default value in case the sequence is empty. The last overload is used with a lambda expression and default value. It returns the first element of the sequence that satisfies a condition, or a specified default value if no such element is found. So, here we also get the first found element, else if the sequence is empty we get the default value we added. These are the four overloads of FirstOrDefault method. As you can see, the key difference between both methods, first and FirstOrDefault, is their behavior when no element is found. First throws an invalid operation exception, while FirstOrDefault return the type's default value, or the default value we entered, depending on the overload we are using. Please keep in mind, if you want to add a default value for the FirstOrDefault method, you have to enter a value of the same data type of the sequence. For example, if we have a sequence on integers, we have to set a default value of integer type. If we have a sequence of strings, we have to set a default value of string type, and so on. Let's go through some examples to understand these methods better. Imagine an integer array containing numbers from 1 to 10. Using a LINQ query to filter out numbers smaller than 7, we get a sequence of type 𝗙𝗵𝗪𝗏 of integer. This contains the following 6 numbers. If we apply the first method, it returns 1 as it's the first element inside this sequence. FirstOrDefault will give the same result in this situation, as long as the sequence is not empty. So, there is no difference between both methods. Both are to return the first element of a sequence, in case the sequence is not empty. But what happens if the sequence is empty? For instance, if we adjust our query to look for numbers greater than 10, the sequence will be empty. Applying first will throw an invalid operation exception, while using the first overload of FirstOrDefault will yield 0, the default integer value. And in case I am using the second overload of FirstOrDefault method in this way, I will get the number 99 as result, which is the default value I added. This is the difference between both methods. First throws an exception if the sequence is empty, whereas FirstOrDefault returns the default value. I used both methods after the query to filter the result of the query, but I can also use both methods within the LINQ query itself, alongside other clauses and methods. That covers the first 3 overloads for these methods. Now, on to the next overloads. Suppose we have the same initial query, returning numbers smaller than 7. As you know, the result of this query is the following sequence. Now, if we want to find the first even number in this sequence, we can use the second overload of the first method like so. Here, we include a lambda expression to filter out the even numbers. So, we filtered the sequence we got from the query. The result of this expression is the following sequence. It contains only the even numbers. Now the first method retrieves the first element of this sequence, which in this case is 2. This is how to use first method with a lambda expression. To demonstrate the use of the first method with a lambda expression, let's alter our query to filter for numbers greater than 8. In this scenario, no numbers meet the criteria, leading to an empty sequence. If you use first method, it will throw an invalid operation exception. On the other hand, using the third overload of FirstOrDefault will return 0, the default value for integers. And using the fourth overload of FirstOrDefault with this default value, we get this value as output, because the sequence is empty. So, no matter which overload is used, both methods behave the same in each overload. First method is always to return the first element of a sequence, in case the sequence is not empty, else it throws an invalid operation exception. And FirstOrDefault returns the first element of a sequence, or the default value if the sequence is empty. Let's summarize both methods again. I added the overloads of both methods on the left side. And here I added both scenarios, either sequence contains elements or an empty sequence. Let's check what happens in each overload. If the sequence contains elements, we get the first element in all overloads. The difference is only when the sequence is empty. First method throws an invalid operation exception in both overloads. The first and third overloads of FirstOrDefault return the type's default value. And the second and fourth overloads return the entered default value. This is the difference between all overloads of both methods. Let's now check some examples to understand how to use the methods in real use cases. The first example is about querying a text file. I have here a text file that contains different lines. I want to read the lines of this file and get the first line, where the word important appears. As you can see, I have in this line the word important. The last line of the file also contains the word important. So, I want to retrieve the first found line which contains the word important. Here is the sequence to do that. In the first activity I am reading the lines of the file. For that I use the function readAllLines with the text file path. The output will be stored in this variable. It's a string array. This variable contains the lines of the file. In the next activity I wrote the LINQ query to retrieve the line I need. Here I am looping the lines of the file. After that I filtering the lines to get only these, which contain the word important. At the end I am selecting the matching lines. So, the output of this part is a sequence that contains only the lines, which contain the word important. After the query I use the FirstOrDefault method to retrieve the first found line. I can also use first method, and the result will be exact the same. The result of the query will be stored in this variable, which is of type string. At the end I used WriteLine activity to print out the result of the query. Let's execute the code to check the result. As you can see, I got the line that contains the word important. It's the first found line in the file, that contains the word important. Let's now edit the text file and add the word important in another line, to check if the code is running correctly. I will write the following text here. This line is now the first line in the file that contains the word important. Let's execute the code again and check if we get a new result. As you can see, I got a new line as result, which also contains the word important. This is how to query a text file and return the first line, that meets the criteria we set. Let's check another example of a data table. I have the following sequence. First I define the table. It contains 3 columns and 6 rows. I have 3 different IDs. The ID number 1 appears twice. The ID number 2 appears only once. The ID number 3 appears 3 times. In the third column we have different zip codes. The task is to get the unique rows based on the ID column. This means, I want to get each ID only once. Let's see how to do that using a LINQ query. Here I am looping the rows of the table. After that I am grouping the rows based on the ID column. The result of the grouping will be stored in the variable grp. So, the result until now will be the following 3 groups. Each group represents an ID, and contains the matching rows. After that I used first method to retrieve the first row from each group. So, the result will be the following 3 rows. At the end I used copy to DataTable, to convert the output to DataTable. After the query, I added the following loop to print out the result. Let's execute the code to check the output. As you can see, I got only 3 rows. Each row represents an ID. This is how to get the unique rows based on only one column. Suppose I want to retrieve the unique rows based on all columns, not only the ID column. For that I have to change the grouping criteria. I used the ID column before, but now I want to use all columns. I can write each column in the same way as I did for the ID column. But there is an easier way to do that. I used here the item array property. In this way I am selecting the content of all columns of the table. So, now the result of the group by clause will be the following 5 groups. Each group contains the rows, which have the same content in all columns. Now using first method we should get only the first row from each group. Let's execute the code to check if we get these 5 rows. As you can see, I got the following 5 rows what I mentioned before. So, the code works fine and retrieves the unique rows from the table, based on all columns. I used here first method, but I can also use first or default method and the result will be the same. These are some examples how to use both methods, first and first or default. I used in both examples the first overload, but I can also use the other overloads as I showed you at the beginning of the video. Later in the course we will also use both methods in other examples. That's all you have to learn about both methods.